Hi, friends. This is Ike, the conservative trans Aussie Turk. Huh. I am writing to you today via video about my protest on the 11th of July against Harvey Road Tavern and Isaac Butterfield, a influencer whom I believe confidently meets the criteria of a white supremacist and someone I know has spread disinformation in his videos before. The protest will be held at 5 p.m. and it is in front of Harvey Road Tavern, Gladstone. So if any of you have some time and you would like to join and it doesn't impact your NAIDOC celebrations, please do come join me because I am adamant that this man is trying to harm our social cohesion here in Australia, and I'd like to do something to stop that. As a part of my evidence building, I'd like to take the next few days leading up to the protest to analyze a few of Isaac's videos and highlight the inconsistencies and my anticipations of his attempts to cause division amongst Australian society. So this video is called The Other Stolen Generation, and it was insensitively shared on NAIDOC Week. You'll find out shortly why it is incredibly tone deaf, but let's not delay further. Take a look.
We talk about the stolen generation all the time in this country, about the 100,000 plus Aboriginal kids that were taken from their families. Some people estimate more, some people estimate less, but that's not important.
Okay, so let's quickly unpack this desire of his to conflate everything. When he says we always talk about the stolen generation, we don't always talk about the stolen generation. Yes, it is a part of our curriculums, but only to such a minimal extent. I personally had very little understanding of the First Nations community, and I still probably only know maybe 0.1% of what actually took place within their communities culturally, historically, traumatically, all of it. In January 8 to January 21 of this year, so it's new, there was a survey conducted. It was a national survey, so not a particular group or not a particular area. It was a national survey where 1,503 Australian residents over the age of 18 participated in a survey where they answered their questions of knowledge and interest in different parts of Australian topics. Part of that survey was about the Indigenous community. And 32% of respondents said that they were actually interested in Indigenous history. Then, of the people surveyed, only 22% actually affirmed that they had confident knowledge about Indigenous history. So that's just slightly above 1/5 of Australia. And the stats would suggest, if anything, that we aren't educating Australians enough about what happens with our First Nations community, both in the past and presently, because 1/5 of Australia is a small number considering this is our own history. All right, let's continue.
But at the exact same time, it was happening in England. 130,000 children documented, could be more, could be less. They were documented as to be taken from their homes, removed from their families and sent abroad, sent to the Commonwealth. And a good portion of those children arrived here in Australia.
Okay, now I don't mean to sound insensitive too, but to start with, Isaac, Australia is responsible for the crimes against humanity committed in Australia and by Australian people. So he throws a big number in there, the 130,000 total migrants from the UK to Commonwealth nations. However, in reality, it was about 7,000 child immigrants who came from the UK and also Malta during the time frame that he is going to reference in this video, based on Isaac's number of 130. That would mean that only about 5.4% of these immigrant children were actually sent to Australia. And that's not exactly well encompassed by a phrase like a good portion. It wasn't a good portion, it was a small portion. And if we go after dates shared by whocaresScotland.org, where they did say 150,000 to the 10,000 who came to Australia, that would even further reduced the percentage down to 3.6%. So it was a very small number of these kids who actually came to Australia. And while it doesn't negate the abuses that they faced, Australia isn't the main perpetrator of the wider issue. All right, shall we continue?
without their parents, and the parents didn't even know where they went. They were just gone. They were shipped off and forgotten about. This is a stolen generation of white children. This is a generation forgotten. This is a generation of children who have no history. It's called the British Child Migration Scheme, and what it was literally kidnapping children. And you know what? When Kevin Rudd made the apology speech to the Indigenous children a part of the stolen generation, he also referenced these kids. But it's interesting because one group, the Indigenous group, they became a part of the curriculum in schools and everyone learnt about it and everyone talked about it. The other group, forgotten, never to be spoken of again. And I think it's uncomfortable to learn the truth about why, is because right now, people don't give a shit about white people when it comes to shit like this.
Oy vey, where do we start? Okay, it is due to self-defeating, reified statements like people don't give a shit about white people that ultimately reduces this video to nothing more than a racist, white, male defensive rant. I'm sorry to say, but I'm not the only one that will perceive him this way. That is precisely how he is coming off. And honestly, he giggled when he said white people. Like, even in my opinion, even he understands that he's full of shit. Seriously. Anyhow, let's break this down more. First of all, upon further investigation, I came to find out that these immigrant children are actually part of a wider group of kids known as the care leavers of Australia. Now, they're also referred to as the forgotten Australians, like Isaac mentioned. However, upon completing my research, it was apparent care leavers don't appreciate that term. The reason is that it carries some derogatory connotation to it, whereas a care leaver means you've left care and it's associated to the abuses faced in childcare institutions of the 20th century. I know this because I conducted research that went beyond ChatGPT's summarized sixth grade explanation, not to point any fingers. Care leavers comprised about 500,000 children, and in the 20th century, there were a lot of kids being taken out of their homes and placed into foster care systems, government and non government care systems for children. But of the 500,000, the stolen generation made up about 50,000 of these kids, and about 7 to 10,000 were the UK migrants. The other 440,000 were non Indigenous Australians. Had you done your research, you could have inflated your white lives don't matter rant with an even bigger number than what you originally considered with your video. It isn't First Nations Australians preventing care leavers and their horrific experiences from being an obligatory part of our educational curriculum. That responsibility falls directly onto Parliament and the education ministers throughout history and the education department itself, all of which are primarily managed by, you're not going to like it, but Anglo-white Australian citizens. It's not multicultural Australians. It's not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Australians. It's the Anglo-white leadership-heavy demographic called our parliament. The stolen generation is part of our curriculum because the First Nations community refused to let their history be erased. If you want to blame anyone for dismissing white history, let's be clear on whom, because there's no connection there to First Nations people or the topic of stolen generations. I don't particularly understand why you have to dismiss the stolen generation or try and create this imaginary blame factor. Well, it's not their fault either way. So why did you have to bring the stolen generation into the picture? You could have achieved a much greater response from the community if you specifically focused on the care leavers of Australia, because the stolen generation is a part of that. There was no need to divide them or to race bait people into another culture war of yours. Moving on. The honest answer at the end of the day, Isaac, if you want to know why care leavers are historically seldom spoken about, it is because of you and your parents and their parents' parents and so on, because it's your demographic that spends a tedious amount of time and effort to bury the atrocities committed by Christian and Catholic organizations, the ones massively in charge of care leavers, the majority of their abusers, and the organizations of which many continue to exist today. Some of those organizations were the Salvation Army, Anglicare, Christian Brothers, Uniting Care, and Ozchild. So if you want to blame someone, you're going to have to make a video about white people oppressing white people, but don't get the rest of Australian society involved and don't try and pit us against one another because it has nothing to do with the diverse parts of Australia. This is specifically something to do with you and your own demographic, mate. All right, let's keep going.
Now, I don't know if that's something to do with virtue signaling, like if we talk about people who aren't white, we seem like we're better people, and if we do mention white people, we're going to seem like we're bad people because it's a right-wing talking point to talk about white kids or white people or anything like that, or seem to give a shit, when I think the reality is this: you're allowed to give a shit about both.
I'm going to stop him right there because I think that's the perfect place to end his part of the video. Isaac, you are 100% correct in that most humans with empathy do in fact care about all children and would not be insensitive or prejudiced enough to make videos where they dismiss another child's and their family's abuse to sensationalize the one of their own ethnicity. He is right about one thing, and that is about Australia needing to disseminate on a larger scale facts about 20th century care leavers and the horrors that they faced while under the care of almost entirely religious institutions, both government and non. Why do we avoid these heftier inquisitions into organizations with long term histories of permitting or perpetuating abuse? Why do we continue to allow these organizations to exist under the same immunities that they did back then, still today, even though the same abuses from half a century ago continue to occur under their care today? I mean, if the churches themselves are participating in hiding and enabling these types of abusive behaviors, they need to be held accountable on a larger scale, not just individual people. Why is the Australian government consistent with protecting religious organizations, especially those aligned with Christianity or Catholicism? Why do we let that happen? Why are we not paying more heed to the abuses of care leaver histories, Isaac asks? And my answer remains the same. It is because no one is capable of taking on Christianity or Catholicism. Finally, may I highlight the ill-intended timing of this particular video by Isaac? It was posted at the beginning of NAIDOC week. Isaac posting about the stolen generation on NAIDOC week is poor form, especially because he's using them as a tool to amplify his white erasure complex. He doesn't wish our Aboriginal communities a happy or positive NAIDOC week. He doesn't utilize his platform at any point during this clip to express any genuine care for the Indigenous community. He shares no message of hope or love. Why can't it just be focused on the community he is trying to spread awareness for? So, to put it simply, this video is another example of his concern trolling, where a person portrays sympathy or empathy, such as Isaac, in my opinion again, pretending to care about British immigrant children. They then use that example intently, albeit in Butterfield's cases, it's typically indirectly to minimize and ultimately create a negative experience between the audience and his targeted demographic, who in this video were our First Nations people during, again, the week of NAIDOC. And so I ask you, finally, the viewer, after watching Isaac's video, do you feel more educated, more hopeful, and inspired to learn about history? Or are you simply left feeling anger and betrayal, even a little offended by Aboriginal people? Because the way he speaks, it's almost as though he's blaming the Indigenous community for us not speaking more about the entirety of care leavers in Australia. And if your answer is yes, then what I am trying to tell you is that my analyses of his content, and not just his, but many other radical far right extremists or who align with far right extremism, is intentionally trying to plant those seeds of distrust for other communities. Finally, to all care leavers and their loved ones. I am deeply sorry that we have to put you in the middle of this argument. It shouldn't be something that we're even dealing with. And unfortunately, in cases like Isaac's, he doesn't make people want to learn more about your history. He makes people just not want to care even more because the way he paints everything, it's negative and ultimately harmful. But I'd want you to understand there are many of us who do share your desire to see retribution or freedom from the injustices you faced while in the extremely broken care system. And you're not alone, and I would be honored to interview those of you willing to share your stories someday. Other than that, happy NAIDOC week, everyone, and please take care of yourselves. Thank you.